Coming to you entirely pre-recorded from the Garage of Solitude here in Whitestone, Queens, I am Mario Francisco Robles, and this is episode 5 of the Superman on Film podcast. Welcome to the show, where we are currently celebrating 48 weeks. That's right, it is 48 weeks until Superman comes out, till James Gunn's Superman flies into theaters, giving us a brand new Man of Steel to follow for hopefully many, many years to come. You know, this week, a lot of folks are talking about Hugh Jackman's return as Wolverine and Deadpool and Wolverine. We're talking about these legendary runs that actors like Hugh Jackman and Wesley Snipes have had playing their iconic superhero characters for a very, very long time. And honestly, it's got me hoping we get to say the very same thing about David Corenswet one day. Wouldn't it be nice to have a generational Superman again? A Superman who is Superman for everyone around the world for many, many years to come. You know, it's kind of crazy that the last actor to really own that role was Christopher Reeve. And there has not been a new Christopher Reeve Superman movie since 1987. So we're going on, 37 years without a brand new mantle holder. And what I mean by is, we've had other Supermen, right? We've had Brandon Routh cast for Superman Returns. We've had Tom Welling over in the Smallville landscape. We have had Tyler Hoechlin killing it over on Superman and Lois. And we've also had Henry Cavill in movies. But in terms of who has the biggest reach, right? Movies are the biggest international medium. And only one actor ever has gotten more than one solo movie ever. And that was Christopher Reeve. Right? Brandon Routh never got a sequel to Superman Returns. Henry Cavill never got himself a direct sequel to Man of Steel. And as wonderful as Tom Welling is, as wonderful as Tyler Hoechlin is, as wonderful as the TV Supermen have been, it's hard to become the generational Superman that everyone grows up around when you're just on a TV show, unfortunately. Even though, listen, George Reeves did a great job of doing just that in the 1950s, but it's a different era now. It's a different time. And to be the icon, to be the Superman, you got to have a striving, successful, thriving, I should say, film franchise. So here we are with hoping and hoping and hoping that they're going to get it right this time around. And since we're talking about what is essentially a reboot, that is why this week's show is going to focus on the last time that Hollywood attempted to reboot Superman. But before we get to that, how about the Superman on Film update for this week? Well, are you ready? Are you sitting down? Are you taking notes? The Superman on Film update this week is... there really isn't one. This kind of takes me back to how it used to be, where when there wasn't a movie in production, I would try to offer you updates on things, and sometimes there was just literally nothing to talk about. But whereas in the past, the reason there was nothing to talk about was because there wasn't any real movement on a new Superman movie, now it's a much nicer reason. Now it's because principal photography is wrapped, and the cast and crew are all hard at work now on post-production on this film, trying to get it ready for us for July 11th, 2025. So right now, while James Gunn is hunkered down in an editing bay, starting to put together his rough cut of the movie and starting to work out the VFX and figure out which things they're going to have to reshoot or add, what things are incomplete, what things need to get tweaked. We're in that fun phase now where they're going to work on that movie until it is absolutely perfect for next year. And for the time being, unless Gunn is out there, having interviews or any of these stars are out there talking about it, I don't anticipate a lot of news coming out of this new Superman project for a bit. But either way, I will be here every week analyzing whatever news, rumors, or tidbits do fall off the table, and as well as coming up with my own insane theories as to what I think all these little things mean. I love to connect the dots. I love to overanalyze things, and I love to try to see if any of my predictions or theories end up being true when the finished product comes out. So as the weeks and months ahead, arrive, we shall see what happens when there isn't news, because there will definitely be things to talk about, but We shall see. But for now, let's get to this week's topic, shall we? It is time to start talking about Man of Steel, rebooting Superman. This was the last time that Hollywood attempted to do what it's doing right now. And on June 14th, 2013, we were given a Superman movie directed by Zack Snyder, produced by Christopher Nolan, and starring Henry Cavill and Amy Adams in what was going to be, hopefully at the time, seen as the bright launch pad for a brand new cinematic future for Kal-El, for the last son of Krypton. And, well, there's lots to discuss. So let's go all the way back to the beginning, because in order to understand how we arrived at Man of Steel, you have to understand what Warner Brothers had been trying to cook up for the 11 years leading up to its arrival. The road to Zack Snyder's Man of Steel, believe it or not, began all the way back in 2002, when Warner Brothers was trying desperately to figure out how to revive its DC Comics brand. Because up to that point, there had been 2 successful DC Comics film franchises, but both had ended poorly. We had Superman, who got 4 movies from 1978 through 1987. And by the time we got to the 1987 film, people had pretty much given up on the Superman movie franchise. It was not well received. It did not do well. And it kind of became the reason that Christopher Reeve was done with Superman for the foreseeable future, until his injury made it so that he had no choice but to be done with Superman forever. So the Superman franchise had ended back in 1987 under not so great circumstances. Then, starting in 1989, DC had gold again with Batman. And just like with Superman, he got 4 solo movies, and then the 4th one kind of killed things. Similar pattern. This time, instead of 1987, it's 1997. And instead of talking about Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, we're talking about Batman and Robin, starring George Clooney and Chris O'Donnell and directed by Joel Schumacher. That movie did such a number on the Batman franchise that even though Batman had been the hottest thing in Hollywood and the number one superhero property for close to a decade up to that point, DC decided we are not continuing any further. We're not going to make a Batman 5 here. We're not going to continue. And essentially, DC went radio silent for a few years. Now, they started, discussing possibilities for different reboots and things. They had attempted to get Superman Lives, directed by Tim Burton, off the ground for a few years, but that didn't pan out. So all in all, DC was in a rebuilding stage. It was in a bit of an interesting limbo as a brand, and for Warner Brothers as a studio owning DC. They were trying to figure out, how do we make this work? And at the same time, on the other side of town, Marvel was starting to make some noise. Not in a very organized way, because remember, there was no Marvel Studios, and they had to sort of rent their characters out to different studios to try to get the characters adapted into films. But we had Blade come out in the late 90s, and then the big one was Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man, directed by Sam Raimi. When the Sam Raimi film started to come out, Hollywood suddenly realized, whoa. Superheroes can be really big business. And that's why in 2002, Warner Brothers came out of the gate with an announcement that there was going to be a Batman versus Superman movie, and it was going to be directed by Wolfgang Peterson. That's right. So this is a pretty big deal. Out of nowhere, there's no Batman franchise currently running. There's been no Superman franchise for about 15 years at this point. But in 2002, Warner Brothers said, we're going to get a lot of headlines, and we're going to make a lot of noise with this bold approach of a Batman versus Superman project. But the problem is, over the next year or two, they weren't able to get the project in the position that they wanted it to. There were some light discussions about casting, and there were people like Jude Law and Colin Farrell bandied about as potential options for Superman and Batman, respectively. But in 2004, Warner Brothers abandoned that project. And don't worry, there's going to be a whole episode about the different things about just Wolfgang Peterson's discarded Batman versus Superman. So don't worry, I'm going to go longer form, but for now, the TLDR version is that in 2004, they abandoned ship on that, and Warner Brothers announced that rather than go directly into some sort of crossover battle / team up movie, it would behoove them better to reintroduce Batman and reintroduce Superman in their own solo series and then worry about possibly crossing them over. And after 2004, that's where the strategy became, we're going to make Batman Begins and Superman Returns. And what's in a title, right? Batman Begins implies this, we're going back to the beginning. This is a fresh start. This is a new Batman. This is not a Batman that you know. This is a Batman that is just beginning. Meanwhile, there's Superman Returns. This is not a new Superman. This is a Superman that you know very well, and he's returning. It's the Christopher Reeve Superman, just played by somebody else, but we're not going to worry about that right now. But essentially, that's where the studio was at. Okay, after 2004, we're going to make Batman Begins, we're going to make Superman Returns, and once each hero is back up and running, then we're going to find a way to cross-pollinate those two franchises and start making team-up movies. Because you see, in 2004, Warner Brothers was actually ahead of the curve. They were thinking about cinematic universes before anyone could even really consider it. Because remember, Sony only owned the Spider-Man property, and they could only make movies based on the Spider-Man characters. And whoever had Blade could only deal with the Blade universe. And Fox only had X-Men and Fantastic Four characters, but they couldn't get into the Avengers stuff. No one could really make a cohesive, coherent universe. But Warner Brothers never had that problem. Because unlike Marvel, Warner Brothers has owned DC outright for over 60 years. So in 2004, Jeff Robinov and the people running Warner Brothers Studios seemed to see the writing on the wall that there could be some serious money if we can start having crossover event movies where we can start creating a larger connected universe with all these characters that mirrors the comic books that they come from. You know, they started looking at it right then and there, but they decided rather than dive right into it, we're going to do slow and steady wins the race. We'll introduce a brand new Batman. We will reintroduce a beloved version of Superman, and then we'll get to that Batman versus Superman. And listen, Batman Begins and Superman Returns ultimately did very similarly at the box office. Neither one ran away as some runaway smash comparative to Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man movies. No one was doing the kind of business that was going to make the Pirates of the Caribbean, which were very hot at the time, suddenly look back. You know, neither one absolutely crushed it, but the big difference is Batman Begins cost far less and was reviewed far more positively. And Warner Brothers liked what Christopher Nolan did. They liked his approach to that universe, and they all of a sudden were all in on the Nolan thing. But when Superman Returns came out a year later, and the reviews were a little more tepid, and the box office was just okay for a movie that was far more expensive than Batman Begins was, it made it for two very different futures for these two characters. It made it so that Batman Begins was now the beginning of an all-new trilogy. And it made it so Superman Returns was now we don't know what we're going to do next kind of a limbo for Warner Brothers and everyone kind of calling the shots for DC at the time. Because life after Superman Returns, if you were a fan like me, it was very weird. You know, I had waited 19 years for a new Superman movie. You know, I'm old enough that I was in a theater in 1987 watching Superman 4 as a 4-year-old boy. I was old enough to have lived that. And then I'd waited 19 years of trials and tribulations to be there opening night for Superman Returns. And yet, since the movie it didn't blow critics away. It did all right. It had a moderately favorable in mid-70s Rotten Tomatoes score and all that kind of stuff. And it made over $400 million. But it just didn't catch on. Afterward, I could see all the discussion online. A lot of people thought, man, Superman Returns had no action. And man, it was too nostalgic. And it was basically a rehash and a remake of the first movie. And I couldn't really argue against it. I really couldn't. And there will be a Superman Returns episode where I go into greater detail about what that movie was like and, all of that stuff. But for now, in the immediate aftermath of that movie, myself and fans like me were pushed into our own Phantom Zone limbo, waiting to see what would happen. Because we could see, even those of us who loved Superman Returns, could see this movie wasn't perfect. It had some good stuff to it. It had some good ideas, but it needed a little something more. It needed some more action. It needed some more adventure. It needed some more of the actual charm and whimsical nature of the movie it was trying so hard to copy and sequelize, Superman the movie. Somehow, Superman Returns had managed to copy so much of the Superman the movie formula, but forgot to include a little something like joy and humor and the wonder and awe of being Superman. It was basically just a somber affair. So after that film came out, there was a lot of hemming and hawing and back and forth about the creative direction that was chosen for the film. And there was definitely not the usual mandate for a sequel. A lot of times when a new hot superhero property comes out, by the end of weekend one, you're hearing from the studio, we've got part 2 coming for you. Especially at that time, it felt like sequel announcements were getting dropped immediately. There were a lot of hot franchises and they were all getting new installments every other year. But Superman Returns came out and there was not talk of a sequel right away. You had Bryan Singer walking around in interviews about where he'd like to go next, and he started kicking around this idea of a movie called Man of Steel. And he was comparing it to what he was going to do there was going to be what he did with X-Men, where the X-Men movie was a little bit, in his eyes, a little bit more of a slow and plodding movie there to really just kind of like establish the characters and set the tone and give us the world that we're here to play in. But it was X2, X-Men United, which was which was the movie that got him the Superman job, by the way. But with X2, X-Men United, he took the setup from the first movie and now gave us, a modern comic book movie classic in that movie that now had more intriguing characters and some big twists and turns. It had more action and adventure. I mean, even beyond his own X-Men to X2 comparison, he was also comparing it to former Star Trek movies, because a lot of people felt that the first ever Star Trek film adaptation was also a little bit on the slow, nostalgic kind of, just missing something kind of element for Star Trek fans. And it was really Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, where all of a sudden, whoa, this is what we wanted from a Star Trek movie. Wrath of Khan was the big answer to fans who were dying to see Star Trek done on that huge epic scale. And Wrath of Khan delivered where the first Star Trek movie hadn't. So Singer was basically saying, I'm sorry you didn't love the first one, but I promise you're going to love part 2. And, the part 2 just never came. 2006 became 2007, 2007 became 2008, and literally here we are going on years of waiting for some kind of announcement, and those of us who had bought into Brandon Routh's Superman, campaigning for him, sharing artwork of him, wanting to see him soar, wanting to see him get his chance to be this generation's Superman. We were all waiting. I remember being on discussion boards, having all these passionate talks with other fellow Superman fanatics about, how Superman Returns could be saved with a better sequel. And there's no reason to just let that be one and done. And yet nothing came of it. And for a while you could, Warner Brothers started letting it be known that they were not certain what to do next. Were they going to try to push ahead on a sequel? Or were they going to reboot? And here's where things start getting interesting. Because in 2008, the studio started taking pitches for reboots. And it's funny because it kind of makes me think about what happened with James Gunn and Black Adam and the stuff that I had discussed on last week's episode, where James Gunn had been asked to write a reboot of Superman, and yet another boss at DC Studios okayed a different version of Superman appearing in Black Adam and setting up his own sequels and Man of Steel 2 and all this stuff. So it's an interesting parallel, because in 2008, before any kind of official announcement had been made, Warner Brothers started secretly taking meetings for a reboot. And it's interesting, some of the people that they had making pitches, it's insane. It's a who's who of like comic book titans. All right. In June of 2008, Grant Morrison, Mark Waid, Jeff Johns, and Brad Meltzer were all amongst people who made pitches to Warner Brothers about a reboot. And apparently it was both Morrison and Waid made the point that Marvel's The Incredible Hulk, which had just come out that month, Marvel's The Incredible Hulk, starring Edward Norton, proved that audiences can forget about a crappy movie if you give them something new to latch onto. And if you remember, The Incredible Hulk came out only a couple of years after Ang Lee's Hulk had come out and made people go, ugh, what are they doing with the Hulk? So since The Incredible Hulk had come out and seemingly wiped away those concerns, both Waid and Morrison were making the pitch to Warner Brothers that we can treat Superman Returns like Ang Lee's Hulk. Let's just make another movie and forget that one happened and let's start from scratch. And it's interesting too, because according to reports at the time, Grant Morrison's idea was very much going to be an adaptation or very similar to what he did in All-Star Superman, which is one of the books that James Gunn is drawing inspiration from for his new movies. So that's cool. But yes, Grant Morrison wanted something that was kind of like All-Star Superman, while Mark Waid was thinking of something more akin to his Birthright book. And then there was also Mr. Mark Miller, who was working on a pitch alongside director Matthew Vaughn, and they famously compared what they wanted to do to like some kind of like a Godfather trilogy. They wanted to go to this intense trilogy where by the end, Superman is the last living being on Earth, because since he's essentially immortal, he's the last one here as our yellow sun dies. And, it's a whole like crazy epic situation. But ultimately, the studio didn't go with any of those pitches, but they were clearly open to a reboot. And 2 months after they began these meetings with the likes of Morrison and Waid and Johns and them, Warner Brothers suggested at last in public that Superman Returns will not be getting a sequel, but rather a fresh start. Here's what the studio head Jeff Robinoff said about the film. He said, Superman Returns didn't quite work as a film in the way that we wanted it to. It didn't position the character the way he needed to be positioned. Had Superman worked in 2006, we would have had a movie for Christmas of this year or 2009. Now the plan is just to reintroduce Superman without regard to a Batman and Superman movie at all. So here he was in August of 2008, basically throwing in the towel on that Batman versus Superman idea that had first been floated around 6 years prior in 2002, and instead basically admitting that maybe we should have reintroduced Superman also. It should have been Superman Begins instead of Superman Returns also. But essentially, it was in August of 2008 that we got the official word that there will not be a sequel. We're going to get something fresh and forget about those other plans we had mentioned. We're going in a brand new direction. So that was August of 2008, the official announcement of a reboot. And yet, meanwhile, over on the Dark Knight set, writer David S. Goyer was having some very interesting conversations in 2007 and in 2008 with his Batman Begins and Dark Knight director Christopher Nolan. And in those conversations, he mentioned how a Superman story could be tackled. And he brought up a way to tell a Superman story that's not too far from how they were telling their Batman story that they thought could really connect with modern day audiences. And Nolan was very taken with Goyer's idea. And even though he wanted something more grounded, and that's why he liked Batman, he didn't necessarily like the idea of a larger-than-life flying alien movie. He liked the way that Goyer wanted to approach it. And he saw potential in the idea for that movie. So he had David Goyer and his brother, Jonathan Nolan, start to really flesh it all out and start working on what would be the story and what would be the script. Meanwhile, Warner Brothers had a very interesting conundrum on its hands as 2009 came around, because in 2009, the heirs of Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel, the creators of Superman, came after Warner Brothers, and they filed a big-time copyright lawsuit claiming that their relatives, that the original Siegel and Schuster had basically been conned out of money and royalties, that they had been given what's called a sweetheart deal back when they were asked to sign Superman over to DC Comics. I think they were given something like $25,000, like a one-time payment, and now we own Superman forever, and you don't get any cut of the royalties, and you don't get any of the profits from the TV shows or the movies. No, nothing. So Siegel and Shuster's heirs brought a very interesting lawsuit against Warner Brothers in 2009. And the reason that factors in to Man of Steel was that it actually forced Warner Brothers to have to make sure to have a Superman movie in production by 2011. Because here's how it went, okay? In August of 2009, there was a court ruling where Jerry Siegel's family recaptured 50% of the rights to Superman's origins and Siegel's share of the copyright in Action Comics #1. In addition, a judge ruled that Warner Brothers did not owe the family's additional royalties from previous films. However, if they did not begin production on a Superman film by 2011, then the Siegel estate would have been able to sue for lost revenue on an unproduced film. Isn't that interesting? So in an odd way, this lawsuit kind of forced Warner Brothers to make sure that there was some kind of a Superman film in production. Otherwise, the heirs could say, hey, why aren't you making Superman movies? You are stopping us from being able to make any money on this. You need to have a Superman movie in production, or we're going to sue you. We're going to sue you for, how do they put it? We're going to sue you for lost revenue. Okay? So that's a very interesting little background point here on all of this, where Warner Brothers is trying to figure out what to do next with Superman, and the heirs of the creators are going, yeah, and you better figure it out quick or you're going to owe us a bunch of money. So that was always an interesting subplot to me in getting this movie made. But either way, Warner Brothers knew we need to have a movie in production. And that is why in January of 2010, they officially announced that Christopher Nolan was stepping in to shepherd and mentor a brand new reboot of Superman to the big screen. He was essentially going to bring the talent and approach that he had brought to Batman to such success, and he was going to bring it to Superman now. And that was the big promise. The man who's responsible for the Dark Knight trilogy is now going to bring his considerable talents to Superman. And he will not be directing the movie himself, but he will be shepherding it. He will be the godfather to it. He will be making sure that this film is as good as it can possibly be, because at this point, Nolan was a made man in Hollywood. Because even aside from the Batman movies, everything he had done had been a success. You know, Memento was well received. Insomnia was well received. The Prestige was well received. Everything he was doing and everything he would do, like Inception and Interstellar, like he couldn't miss. He had the Midas touch there for a few years. So when he was announced as the producer on a reboot for Superman, I was ecstatic. I remember being like, whoa, okay, we got a serious guy here to make Superman, and let's see what happens. You know, and the funny thing is, like, even though I knew it was a reboot, and even though, let's see, at this point, I would have been 26 years old, there was a part of me that was like, oh, but I hope they bring Brandon Routh back. And listen, I know it makes no sense, but I equate it to the people now who were like, why won't they bring Henry back? Why didn't James Gunn use Henry for his reboot? I was there. I was there around this time. When they announced the reboot, I was like, come on. Brandon Routh deserves another shot. I'm sure Nolan can come up with some ingenious way to use Brandon Routh and tell a brand new story, but, ultimately I had to give up on that because it does kind of make no sense. How are you going to reboot something and then bring back an actor from the failure that led to the reboot? Right? Doesn't make sense. If Superman Returns had done well, then that would have just gotten a direct sequel. But it didn't. That's why we need a reboot. So why would you bring back the star of that movie? Why? But yet, did that stop me? No. In 2010, I made a Facebook page called Brandon Routh for Nolan's Superman. And I started making all these posts about come on, give Brandon a chance. He deserves it. And I just bring this up for those of you who are still holding that sadness and that anger over Henry Cavill not being involved in James Gunn's movie. I understand. I've been there. But ultimately, when cooler heads prevail, I think you have to acknowledge, just as I have, it doesn't make any sense. If you're going for a fresh start, the last thing you need is the star of the reason you need a fresh start. Okay? But either way, back to what was going on back in 2010. So Christopher Nolan announced he's producing the movie. He's going to shepherd it. He's got all these great ideas. And now he's got to find his director for it. And it's very interesting because in September of 2010, the director's search included some very, very interesting names, including, and I should start with this name because apparently he could have done it, but he turned it down. But Man of Steel could have been directed by Guillermo del Toro. Okay? Guillermo del Toro. Like Pan's Labyrinth? Like what? Seriously? We can get that guy? But he was busy. He turned it down. Apparently, Robert Zemeckis, Back to the Future, Robert Zemeckis, Castaway, Robert Zemeckis, Robert Zemeckis was offered it. Also didn't take it. Other names, Ben Affleck, who apparently was who Christopher Nolan really wanted. If Christopher Nolan could have had his way, Ben Affleck would have directed Man of Steel by most reports. But Ben Affleck also was not interested. And then the other names that came up were Darren Aronofsky, Duncan Jones, Jonathan Liebsman, Matt Reeves, hi the Batman fans, and Tony Scott. I should say now the late Tony Scott. So Nolan was looking at some very, very serious names here. There's some very interesting directors on that list, from Hollywood big hitters to guys who at the time were up and coming storytellers that everyone seemed to want to be working with at the time. But a month after that report came out of that director shortlist, Nolan got his guy. Nolan hired Zack Snyder in October of 2010. And at the time, Snyder was coming off of, his last few movies had been 300, The Legend of the Owls of Ga'Hoole, Watchmen, and Sucker Punch. That was the filmography that led to him getting the Man of Steel job. And, my honest feeling at the time was, what? Him? It just didn't make sense to me. There was nothing about his filmography that had screamed to me, this guy can make a great Superman. On the contrary, I remember interviews when Watchmen came out where people asked, hey, would you want to make a Superman movie? And he kind of scoffed at the idea. He was never really interested in telling a traditional Superman story. He was much more into the more subversive, rebellious, outsider type of comic books where things were a little edgier and darker and stranger. And he wasn't really too into a traditional true blue Superman type of story. So imagine my surprise when I hear that's the guy they hired. It just seemed odd. But even with that being odd, it also made some sense to me because we knew that he wasn't involved in scripting. We knew that the project had already been in some form of pre-production already, and that essentially Snyder was just a hired gun. He was coming in to shoot this script that Nolan and Goyer had crafted carefully for them and to execute on a vision that they had for this movie. And I always find that just an interesting point to bring up, because when people talk about Zack Snyder's DC, when people talk about his vision and the films that happened and didn't happen and his goals for these characters, they always tend to speak about it as if Zack Snyder was the architect right out of the gate, as if Zack Snyder had anything to do with the birth of Man of Steel. When in actuality, Man of Steel was a production that was already happening, and he was brought in as a director for hire, a hired gun to make this movie. You know, it's just very interesting because sometimes people try to act like Man of Steel was just the first step in this big story he was trying to tell. But it's like, no, someone else came up with that first part of the story, and then he decided what he wanted steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 to be. But step 1, Zack Snyder had hardly anything to do with. But nonetheless, let's go back to the time frame here. He got the job in October of 2010, and that put us directly into casting. That's when casting rumors started to pop up over these next couple of months. And it's interesting. Christopher Nolan seemed to really want to take a page out of Richard Donner's book here, where you get a relatively little-known actor, primarily maybe with TV experience, but, you know, a smaller, lesser-known actor, and then surround that actor with a very prestigious, incredible cast, which is what he commented. If you watched last week's show, you know Nolan absolutely adored that approach that Richard Donner took with Superman, the movie. So here he is once again. He had done it with Batman Begins, surrounding Christian Bale with an excellent award-worthy cast. And now this time, when it was time to cast Superman, the producer and his director were looking at a bunch of actors, none of whom were big movie stars at the time. The names that were floating around were, are you ready for this one? Tyler Hoechlin, who plays him now on Superman and Lois. Okay, Tyler Hoechlin auditioned. Matthew Good, Armie Hammer, Jamie Dornan, Joe Manganiello, and Colin O'Donoghue. If you're scratching your head on a bunch of those, you're not alone. But again, they were looking for unknowns at the time. They wanted someone who could just step in out of nowhere and seemingly just be Superman, not be this actor that everyone has seen elsewhere who's now dressed as Superman. You know, they wanted that unknown talent who could really step in and embody the role. And what's interesting is that there was one particular TV actor who claims to this day that if not for his TV obligations, he would have been the star of Man of Steel. And that actor is Joe Manganiello. At the time, he was starring as Alcide on HBO's very successful series True Blood. And his filming Man of Steel would have eaten into his participation in season 4 of True Blood. So ultimately, the producer said, no, you can't have him. And that is why he wasn't Superman. That is according to him. Maybe there's more to the story. I've never seen anyone refute that idea. I've heard little rumors, too, that it was like Nolan wanted Cavill, Snyder wanted Manganiello, but Manganiello was busy, Nolan got his pick, and Snyder made the most of it. But there we go. So yes, Henry Cavill officially joined the cast in January of 2011. So it took a couple of months for casting to take place, but Henry Cavill was cast in January of 2011, and that was a big deal. That was a big deal for him, and it was a big deal for fans of his, even though, you know, he wasn't that well known yet. But you know what? There were people who knew that he'd almost been Superman already, because he had been cast in a previous reboot attempt. When J.J. Abrams had written Superman Flyby for McG, during that era, Henry Cavill was set to play Superman in Superman Flyby back in 2003 or 2004, around then. And then, when that project got scuttled off, Bryan Singer had him audition for Superman Returns. So Henry Cavill was also almost Superman again. But this time, third time was the charm. He was cast for Man of Steel, and he got to actually play the part this time. And they surrounded him with this incredible cast. Because while he was the relatively unknown actor, around him you had Amy Adams, Michael Shannon, Russell Crowe, Lawrence Fishburne, Kevin Costner, Diane Lane. I mean, they went right back to the original Donner playbook of the unknown actor who looks like he was born to play Superman, surrounded by a prestigious cast. And that's what they did. And in August of 2011, finally, with the casting in place, with the script finalized, the film entered production and began filming. And I'll still never forget getting those first set pictures, getting the news from Plano, Texas, of where they were filming for the Kent farm and all that stuff. Like, listen, even me being skeptical of what Zack Snyder would do with Superman, even me with my concerns about, is this really the right storyteller for this character? It was still every day I had to check the web for fresh pictures from the set and fresh information and start, theory spiraling on what I think everything means. Because again, I cannot help myself. I love Superman. I love this world. I love this mythology. So no matter who's in charge, I'm going to be very interested. So I'll never forget 2011, they start filming. And then a year later, we get the news in June of 2012 that Hans Zimmer is scoring it. And that was huge because up to that point, Superman had had one theme. He had had one real soundtrack, and it was provided by John Williams. It was the only one in terms of, cinematically speaking. In Superman 1, John Williams scored it. And then for Supermans 2, 3, and 4, and in Returns, all the other composers who took over from there basically just redid what he had done already and just reused his motifs. And so when they announced Hans Zimmer and that he was coming in to do something wholly original, just like he had done for Batman Begins, because remember, Batman also had a very well-established theme before Batman Begins came out. Up to that point, Danny Elfman's Batman theme had been like the industry standard for Batman. It even followed Batman to the animated series. So when Hans Zimmer got the Batman Begins job, there was all this, curiosity. Is he going to reuse the Elfman theme? Is he going to create something original? And the same thing happened when he got the job for Man of Steel, where at first there were questions, will this be like a Williams rehash? But Zimmer right away made it very clear this is going to be an original work, that we were going to get brand new music from one of today's most revered composers for our Last Son of Krypton. So that was big news that happened in June of 2012. And for the studio, the big news came in January of 2013 when they successfully won their lawsuit against the Siegel and Schuster heirs. That officially kind of ended the urgency around needing to have this movie made by a certain time to appease certain rules, but that whole lawsuit that was lingering on in the background got resolved around 6 months before the Superman movie finally came out. And now let's talk about it. Because June 14th came around at last, and after many years of waiting, after 7 years since Superman Returns, the world got to see what Warner Brothers had cooked up with this brand new, all new take on Superman. And what did they think of it? The results were very interesting after weekend one, because in terms of cinema score, which is where there is in-person live polling that takes place on opening night, where people who work for an organization called CinemaScore go up and poll people as they leave theaters on opening night, because they know opening night is when a film's biggest supporters show up. So if the biggest supporters feel a certain way about a certain movie, that bodes well, or it bodes poorly, depending on how they feel about it. So CinemaScore is actual in-person polling of people who went to see the movie. And for Man of Steel, they polled it an A-, which is pretty good. A minus is a very good score. But in terms of how that compares to Superman Returns, it was only a marginal improvement over Superman Returns, which had a B plus. So it's literally, they're right there. A minus, the very next level down is B plus. Then in terms of critical response, if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, Superman Returns pulled off a 74% rating and it is considered fresh, where Man of Steel got a 56% rating and is considered rotten. More so than that is what happened with the story that the box office tells. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that. Its opening weekend gross was $116.6 million. That was the third highest of 2013, but it was third behind Iron Man 3 and The Hunger Games 2. So that was notable at the time, that the brand new Superman movie produced by Christopher Nolan from the people who brought you the Dark Knight trilogy didn't do better than The Hunger Games 2 or Iron Man 3. It was the third highest among non-sequels behind The Avengers and The Hunger Games. However, on its second weekend, Man of Steel's box office fell almost 65 to 68% if Thursday night gross is included, putting it in third place behind Monsters University and World War Z. Okay, Box Office Mojo called it an abnormally large drop, close to the second weekend decline of the disastrous Green Lantern movie that DC had put out a couple of years prior. So in terms of its critical response, not as good as Superman Returns. In terms of the fan reaction, marginally better. And in terms of box office, listen, it actually did have a very nice opening weekend. I mean, if Superman Returns had opened to 116.6, I don't think we would have gotten a reboot. But in terms of box office, this thing went on to score $668 million worldwide. It did turn a profit, and it was considered a reasonable success. It was. But for whatever reason, the people who worked within the studio, they were expecting more. They probably thought it would do better than Hunger Games 2. They probably thought they wouldn't have to compete with things like Monsters University and World War Z when you're making a AAA Superman title with prestigious actors and prestigious producers, and you're dumping hundreds of millions of dollars into making, producing, and marketing this thing. They thought this thing was going to be an excuse to print money. And listen, maybe they were ridiculous for that, because if you compare Man of Steel to some of the other Phase 1 movies for Marvel, it did better than most of them. By most accounts, Man of Steel was a soft win. It wasn't a resounding success, but it also wasn't some kind of disaster. And it wasn't the kind of fart in church that Superman Returns ended up being. It actually was well received. For the most part, it gave you the indicators that we can continue from here. And, it's where they chose to go from there that really takes DC on film to a whole new place that I think we're still trying to recover from today. But before I get into any of that, I want to just talk a little bit about just like my take on Man of Steel. Because I remember going on June 13th, 2013, the day before it opened. This time I hadn't been fortunate enough as I had been with Superman Returns. See, with Superman Returns, I got a press invitation because at the time I was helping edit. It's a long story, but I was actually doing some work in media already, and I got a press invitation to Superman Returns. By the time 2013 came around, I was still just back to being just a plain old fan. So I didn't get to go to an advanced screening, but I did go to the preview screening the night before. Because remember, theaters still do that to this day. If a movie comes out on Friday, June 14th, you can see it Thursday night, June 13th, if you're very hardcore about it and you want to do it like that. And that's what I did. On Thursday, June 13th, I went to Times Square with my buddy Jeremy, who was also my +1 for Superman Returns 7 years prior. And he and I sat down and watched Man of Steel. And I remember feeling, this is pretty good. Like it didn't blow me away. It wasn't a religious experience for me as a Superman fan. I remember feeling like I love the opening sequence on Krypton. I love the heft of the story. The fact that they're treating this myth with so much importance. I loved a lot of the visuals, a lot of the overall epic feel. Like in general, I feel like the first hour and a half of that movie is some pretty phenomenal Superman storytelling that I will stand by to this day. Between the score, between the acting, between just the scope of the story being told, it felt big. It felt Nolan. It felt deserving of a brand new take on Superman. But then I remember that once the battle starts in Smallville and continues on through Metropolis, I remembered my eyes started to sort of glaze over. I started just kind of like losing interest. It just started becoming just like some sort of action hero movie extravaganza. And I don't see a hero there who's trying his best to not cause more destruction. I don't see a hero there who's trying to save lives. I just see a big, cool demigod punching another cool demigod around a city and knocking buildings over. It just felt like the priorities of the movie got a little weird in the last 45 minutes. And I remember as I was leaving, my whole initial take was, man, if you could have cut the action down by like 15 or 20 minutes and invested that into more character development and more of just fleshing out the story, I think that's a perfect Superman movie. But since so much of the effort had been put into showing this world-destroying finale, by the end of it all, I just felt cold. I felt a little dead inside. I didn't feel the big victory at the end when Superman wins. It just felt like, okay, so I guess, we finally got our action hero Superman. Now I know why Zack Snyder got the job, because they knew he could make it look good, and he knew that he could deliver on the comic book action of all this. So, I didn't love it. I didn't hate it. For me, it was like a 6.5. And I remember coming down the escalator and I couldn't even understand what the controversy was, because we're going to get to the controversy in a second. Actually, let's just address it. The choice to kill Zod with something that a lot of people were upset about right out of the gate. And it's interesting to me because it didn't faze me at the time. I didn't know what the controversy was. And I don't know what that says about me as a Superman fan. And if you're a Superman fan and you want to judge me for not being offended by that moment, judge away. I don't know what to tell you. It didn't bother me. For me, I remember when Superman killed Zod, all I felt was, well, that could have been built to better. Like, I knew what they were trying to go for. I could tell like, oh, this is an interesting corner to put Superman in, to put him in a position where he feels like he has no choice and he has to kill the last remaining survivor of Krypton. Like, I understood on paper what they were trying to achieve. It just didn't feel that way when I watched it. It didn't feel earned. It didn't feel like they had properly built to it, because the only way that moment really lands is if we see Superman trying his best not to kill Zod first. If throughout that entire confrontation, we have a Superman who's pleading with Zod to not do this, who's pleading with Zod to understand that this is not, we can coexist. It doesn't have to be this way. Like, if you see a Superman who's trying his best to not hurt him, to not hurt Zod, but rather to try to create some kind of a peace or inspire the people of Earth to have hope and stand up for themselves. And there were so many ways they could have gone with it. But instead, we just had Superman punching the hell out of Zod. And we never knew that he wasn't trying to kill him to begin with. We don't know this Clark yet. We don't know his morals, his ethics, his rules, his values yet. We haven't established that the last thing in the world he wants to do is kill Zod. You have to establish that first so that when he makes that fateful decision, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe he had to do that. But it's the only thing he had to do. Wow, that's powerful. That's how you have to build up that moment. And I just didn't think they had done it like that. So when the killing happened, I wasn't fazed. And I think my only real thing was more like, maybe are people upset because they think it's silly that you could snap a Kryptonian's neck? Like, I thought maybe that was it. I'm like, this guy's made out of steel practically. These guys can do everything and anything to each other. To have just a quick little, that's how you killed him? Like, I feel like I would have expected something a little grander, some other larger than life, insane comic book way to kill off Zod. But instead he just snapped his neck. And to me, that was the big thing. I thought maybe people just thought you couldn't just snap Zod's neck. He has a super neck. Like, I literally, I didn't know why people were upset. So I just bring that up because, sometimes people like to think that I must be some kind of a purist, some kind of a traditionalist, traditionalist Superman fan where everything has to be a certain way. And it's like, no. I'm open to all kinds of adaptations, and let's present him in all kinds of unique situations, but just do it with care, do it with thought, set it up right, but either way, I saw that movie and I was still ready for Man of Steel 2. There wasn't anything about that film that I thought was so crap that we couldn't get a part 2. On the contrary, I thought, okay, maybe what this needs is to just get it away from Snyder. You know what I mean? Snyder was hired to direct this. I'm sure when the studio sees the critical response to this, I'm sure when the studio examines that huge box office drop on weekend 2, which means that the people who saw it weekend 1 told their friends not to bother, because that's how that works. Big drop-offs happen because the people on weekend 1 weren't thrilled enough to tell everyone else to go see it. So I was certain that the Warner Brothers brass would see all this and go, okay, so Man of Steel was a decent start. Now we just have to make a Man of Steel 2, and we'll address the concerns people had in the first one. Maybe it'll be less on the balls to the wall action. It'll be less on all of this world destroying stuff, and it'll have more of the heart and the humor and the charm that a Superman story should have. But instead, oh, you want to talk about what happened instead? Because where they went next, it's an infamous decision, and it's one that DC to this day is still licking its wounds, okay? It's licking its wounds over this call because Man of Steel came out in June of 2013, and then at the end of July of 2013, at San Diego Comic-Con, they went ahead and announced, remember that Batman versus Superman movie from 2002? Now it's happening, but it's going to be with this Superman versus a Batman you haven't met yet. Yay! Batman versus Superman was announced in July of 2013, and everyone was so happy about it. Let's get into how they did that, okay? There was an interview in Forbes where Snyder was asked how this came to be. And I'll give you the full question. It came from Mr. Mark Hughes. Hi, Mark. I know Mark. Mark is good people. Mark asked, when you came aboard Man of Steel, were you thinking in the back of your mind, I could be the guy who gets to reboot Batman on film too? And here's what Snyder said. I gotta be honest. It definitely was a thing that after Man of Steel finished and we started talking about what would be in the next movie, I started subtly mentioning that it would be cool if he faced Batman. In the first meeting, it was like, maybe Batman? Maybe at the end of the second movie, some kryptonite gets delivered to Bruce Wayne's house or something, like in a cryptic way. That's the first time we see him. But then, once you say it out loud, right, you're in a story meeting talking about, like, who should Superman fight if he fought this giant alien threat, Zod, who was basically his equal physically from his planet, fighting on our turf? You know, who to fight next? The problem is, once you say it out loud, then it's kind of hard to go back, right? Once you say, what about Batman? Then you realize, okay, that's a cool idea. What else? I mean, What do you say after that? But I'm not going to say all that at all that when I took the job to do Man of Steel that I did it in a subversive way to get to Batman. I really believe that only after contemplating who could face Superman did Batman come into the picture. See, I've always had a problem with that little anecdote from Mr. Snyder, because it's like he makes it sound like it's just so obvious. Like, of course, once you mention Batman as a Superman villain, I mean, it's so obvious right now. How could you ever unsay that? How could you ever not want to do that, right? And I'm like, I've never wanted to see Batman and Superman fight. That has literally never been the approach to those characters that has ever interested me, ever. Like, I remember, like, maybe in middle school, maybe being like 11 or 12 years old at the lunch table, and one of us has a comic book in one hand and the other one has an issue of Wizard magazine in the other. I could see myself arguing with my buddies over who would win and having discussions about kryptonite arrows and Batman's incredible intellect and all that kind of stuff. Like, yeah, sure. As a hypothetical thing for little fanboys to try to hash out, fine. But to launch an entire movie around this concept, like I think they greatly overestimated the interest in that concept. And I thought so at the time. And then when the movie came out, I was proven accurate. But either way, Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice, that was the big announcement. That was the big next place where we decided to go. But it should be noted, too, that Snyder had considered other places to go. There were reports at the time that he had considered a story that would include Brainiac and even Metallo as a villain in what would have been a straight up Man of Steel 2 movie. But instead, by doing the Batman thing, it put them on a express course to try to get directly to that Justice League movie that Warner Brothers Studios seemed to want so badly. So instead of going with Brainiac, instead of going with a solo Superman sequel where we could really build on the conclusion of Man of Steel and take Henry, further down a more traditional Superman path, instead of that, we took this detour to Batman versus Superman, where Batman hates Superman and they're going to have a fist fight. And then by the end, Superman's going to die at the hands of Doomsday. And we're going to I don't know. It was a decision that will haunt them for the rest of their days. And it's one that we got to hope that James Gunn's Superman doesn't have to still pay the price for, because it feels like DC on film has been paying the price for Batman versus Superman for the last 8 years. But circling back to what this episode is about, because there will be a Batman versus Superman episode of this show, but bringing it back to Man of Steel itself, the promising beginning that didn't get continued past that point. It should be noted that the biggest thing that Zack Snyder added, creatively speaking, because remember, he wasn't there for the scripting process. The biggest thing that Zack Snyder changed in that movie, his big creative touch, was that in the original script, General Zod was going to get sucked into the Phantom Zone. He wasn't going to be killed. That was Snyder and that was Goyer, who thought, we can't just get rid of him that way and put him back in the Phantom Zone. We got to kill him off. We got to put him in a scenario where Superman feels no choice but to kill him. And Christopher Nolan was not on board with that. He eventually came around and okayed it, because it's what Goyer wanted. And ultimately, he believes in filmmaker-driven films. So if that's what Zack Snyder wanted to do with his Superman movie, that's what Zack Snyder was going to do with his Superman movie. But you'll also notice that after Man of Steel, Christopher Nolan's involvement with any of these DC films was over. That was it. So he was there to get Man of Steel off the ground. He let Snyder make that bold decision to kill off Zod, which ended up being one of the biggest, most polarizing aspects of the movie. And as soon as it became that Man of Steel was now going to be turned into the launch pad of the DCEU and a Justice League movie and a Suicide Squad movie, and they were going to they were going to make like 7 years worth of DC movies on its back. That's when Nolan said, "Okay, y'all, I'm out now. This is not what I wanted to be a part of." That has always been an interesting little subplot too, about how Nolan could not have been more involved at first. But by the time the film came out and was received and the studio got its hands into trying to now build a whole DC universe, that's where Nolan was like, I'm out of here. And so with this episode almost at its proper conclusion, I think we got to just drop the final gavel on Man of Steel, the last attempt to reboot Superman. And ultimately why I think it failed at doing what it set out to do. The reason I think it failed is that it was just way too familiar. It begged to be compared to what had come before. Just to put into perspective, General Zod did not exist until 1961. Superman was invented in 1938. Okay? General Zod did not exist for the first 23 years of Superman's existence. And he was not made an integral part of any origin of Superman, really ever. And then 1978, Superman the movie comes out, and suddenly General Zod is a household name. But is he a AAA Superman villain? Is he the only Superman villain? No. Is he the Superman villain that you have to address in order to tell Superman's origin story? No. But what villain did Man of Steel choose to center on? General Zod. Another one, Jonathan Kent. He doesn't always have to die. He's not Uncle Ben from the Spider-Man comics, as I've always pointed out. Jonathan Kent does not have to die when Clark is a teenager for him to become Superman. But that was something that, once again, in 1978, that film chose to do that. In 2013, when Man of Steel came out, they could have chosen to go another way. They also killed off Jonathan Kent. But now, what other similarities are there? Let's see. How does Superman the movie begin? Superman the movie begins on the alien planet Krypton with Jor-El, who's warning everyone that Krypton is about to die. Jor-El having a scene with his wife, putting the baby in a pod and speaking about what his destiny will be and how great things are going to be on Earth. And he's speaking to his wife who doesn't seem to fully understand and wishes there was some other way. And also in that first scene on Krypton, we have Jor-El sentencing Zod and his minions to a lifetime in the Phantom Zone. And as part of that sentencing, we have a General Zod shouting about how he's going to get revenge, if not on him, then on his heirs. Does any of that sound familiar? I will find him! Like, the opening of Man of Steel is a literal paraphrase of the opening of Superman the movie. Okay, it's the same premise. Krypton's about to blow up. Zod is sent to the Phantom Zone. He'll eventually be freed to go attack Kal-El on Earth because Kal was sent to Earth after Krypton exploded. It's the same basic premise. They basically took Superman 1 and 2 and shrunk it down into one movie. So if you take the big final battle of Superman versus the Kryptonians in Metropolis, you've got Superman 1 and 2 all buried within Man of Steel. Okay? Yes, we didn't do him falling in love with Lois and giving away his powers for a little while, but the core guts of the story are exactly the same. If Man of Steel wanted to reboot Superman, if Man of Steel wanted to not be compared to the Christopher Reeve movies, if they wanted to not be compared to what Richard Donner had done, they had a million ways to go. Superman has so many villains. His origin can be told in so many different ways. You're already going to tell a movie that jumps around in terms of chronology. So why don't you just open up with Clark in Metropolis already and tell us a bunch of things in flashbacks? Why don't you give us a first villain that has nothing to do with Lex Luthor or General Zod? Because, there are countless of them to choose from. Why don't you let Jonathan Kent live? There's so many different ways that this could have set itself apart. You look at other reboots that were successful, and it's all right there. When Christopher Nolan redid Batman and he did Batman Begins, did he make a movie that felt at all like Tim Burton's 1989 Batman? No. The Gotham looked different. The tone and vibe of everything looked different. Joker wasn't the villain. It was a whole, it literally right out of the gate. You start watching Batman Begins, and it's almost impossible to start thinking of Tim Burton's Batman. It's clearly something totally new and different. Same thing with Spider-Man. I brought that one up before too. The other day I watched the first few scenes of The Amazing Spider-Man starring Andrew Garfield, and that was an interesting situation because the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies had been an international smash only a couple of years prior. So Spider-Man was still super fresh in people's minds, and people still had very strong opinions about Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man and what Sam Raimi and him had created over 3 films. And yet, when you watch The Amazing Spider-Man, you see something that is boldly different right out of the gate. All right. For the first time ever, we see Peter's parents. And there's this whole espionage subplot where the reason they have to leave and the reason they have to leave Peter with Aunt May and Uncle Ben is because they have to disappear under these mysterious circumstances. And there's this whole subplot of Peter's father possibly still trying to show up and contact him from whatever weird secret mission forced them to abandon Peter forever. Right out of the gate, you watch the first 5 minutes of The Amazing Spider-Man and you're not thinking about Tobey Maguire anymore. You've been told, oh, this is something totally different. And this Peter is nothing like the Peter I know. So, okay, here we go. Now, this is a reboot. It is fresh. It is different. It is a completely different story. Did they make The Amazing Spider-Man go after the Green Goblin? No. Did they make his love interest marry Jane Watson? No. They went to his older love interest, didn't they? In every way, the reboot tries to push in a new direction. When Martin Campbell rebooted James Bond for a second time with Casino Royale could not have looked and felt and been more different than the Bond films that had come before it. And it didn't tell a same story from one of Pierce Brosnan's movies. It told a very different kind of story with a very different kind of villain. If Casino Royale had come out and just been a retread of Die Another Day or something, that would have been a disaster. It would not have been a success. We would not have gotten 4 Daniel Craig James Bond movies. So it's just when you reboot something, it behooves you to present something that is very different. Because when you don't, you end up with Man of Steel. You end up with a movie that a lot of people are now going to compare negatively to what happened before, because you're essentially going to be judged on how did these 2 movies tell the same story? Well, this one told it in a way that was more pleasurable than this one did. Guess what? You can avoid that if the story is completely different. Give me different love interests. Why couldn't it have been Lana Lang? Why couldn't they have focused in on a different part of his life? Why couldn't it have been a completely different villain? Why? It's just with Man of Steel, as much as I love Nolan, honestly, at this point, I'm kind of over the Nolan thing. I've been over Nolan for ages. But at the time, as much as I respected Nolan, as much as I felt David Goyer brought the goods for that Dark Knight trilogy, I am never going to understand why they thought it would basically be okay to just tell an echo of Superman the movie. You had your chance here, especially because Bryan Singer had already done that. Superman Returns attempted to be Superman 5. It was already attempting to make you think of the Reeve movies, and that hadn't gone well. The world wanted something totally different. But instead of giving us Superman Begins, they gave us Superman the Movie of Steel. It was just, we've been here, we've seen this kind of story, And we had a better time last time this story was told. And I think ultimately that is the big thing I hope James Gunn has learned. That if you're going to reboot Superman now, it behooves you to just touch new fertile ground. You have decades and decades of Superman stories to tell. He has all these rogues. He has all these amazing background characters that we've never even gotten to really know and meet in the movies. You know, again, like Nolan and Goyer could have told any kind of story. It's so crazy to me that they still just opted to go back to Mario Puzo's, initial bullet points for Superman the movie and just tell that story again. Like, why would you do that? And then why would you do that and then go into the crappy Batman versus Superman afterward? Like, there's so many just baffling decisions that this is why I have to hope that James Gunn is the saner voice that has prevailed at last over at Warner Brothers, who's going to make sure that we get something that's new, that's different, and that draws on stories and things that we've never seen before. Because that's going to be the key to combating any kind of superhero fatigue. That's going to be the key to bringing back DC, which is currently kind of a dead brand unless you're Batman. You know, the big key to all of this is going to be giving us stories and characterizations that capture our imaginations and don't make us think about other things that we liked better. So please, James, if you're watching this, I mean, it's already too late. You've already shot and you're already in post. But I have faith and I hope and I think that you did this right. Because as I look at what has come out so far about this new Superman movie, it doesn't seem like it's going to try to be particularly familiar at all. It looks like we're getting a very different kind of world that seems ripped straight from the comic book pages that we've never really gotten to see for a Superman solo film. So that is my sincere desire for the next reboot of Superman. And those were my thoughts on the last reboot of Superman. So hopefully you enjoyed this look back at Man of Steel, rebooting Superman. Please like, rate, and review the podcast. It really helps a great deal for the algorithms and for the podcatchers for you to be leaving me positive reviews and things like that. Because, listen, we got 48 weeks. There's a lot more to talk about, and I'm ready to bring some more people on board, all right? The excitement for James Gunn's DCU and for what DC Studios is working on, I can feel it mounting. It is palpable. In just the last week alone on Twitter, I'm always going to call it Twitter, by the way. Sorry, Elon. I've gotten 700 more followers. And meanwhile, I haven't even really been doing anything all that special. All I'm doing is sharing quotes from James Gunn himself. Sharing the different things and promises and tidbits and insights that he has shared about, regarding his plans with DC Studios and for the DCU. And simply just sharing those promises, sharing those well wishes has brought me 700 more followers. And I can just feel there are a lot of people out there who are ready to love DC again. They've just been waiting to feel like there's an adult in the room again calling the shots. And more than anything, they just want to believe again. And it's funny, just funny to think that in 1978, Superman made us believe a man can fly. And in 2025, here we are hoping that Superman can make us believe again. Until next time, life is chaos. Be kind. Up and away.